Howard Stern was halfway through his morning coffee when he saw the glint of steel. Not pointed at him, not yet. Just resting on the table in front of a man in the front row of the studio's observation gallery. A man whose name you whispered in the dark corners of Little Italy but never spoke out loud in the light of day. Howard stopped talking. The record on the turntable kept spinning, the needle scratching against the vinyl in a rhythmic hiss that felt like a ticking time bomb. The studio's staff held their breath, frozen in the flickering fluorescent light of 1975 New York. And then Howard Stern did something that would either make him a legend or get him fitted for a concrete suit at the bottom of the Hudson. He walked straight toward the soundproof glass and signaled for the man to come inside the booth. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand New York City in the mid-70s. It wasn't the polished, corporate skyscraper jungle it is today. It was a city on the brink of collapse, owned and operated by the shadows. The unions, the radio stations, the late-night clubs, everything ran through the 5 families, and everyone knew the price of admission. The WNBC studios, where Howard was just beginning to stir up trouble, was a place where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the unspoken rules of organized crime. Frank Sinatra had his own complicated relationship with these men, and even the biggest stars knew when to shut their mouths. But Howard Stern was different. He had grown up in Roosevelt, a town where you either learned to stand your ground or you got crushed by the pavement. He knew these men. He knew how they thought. He knew that in a city like New York, you survived by knowing your place. But Howard also had something that most people didn't have. He had a complete lack of fear when it came to the microphone. In that booth, Howard was untouchable. Not because he was a tough guy, but because he genuinely didn't care about the consequences of the truth. If you didn't like what he had to say, that was your problem. This attitude had served him well, but on a cold Tuesday in 1975, it was about to be tested in a way that nobody could have predicted. The trouble had started 3 days earlier. Howard was in the middle of a late-night broadcast, leaning into the mic with that signature grin, when he decided to take a shot at a high-ranking associate of the Gambino family. He didn't just tell a joke, he dismantled the man's reputation, laughing at the way the mob handled their business in the garment district. His producer, a young woman named Robin, felt the air leave the room. She knew that in 1975 you didn't talk about the Gambinos unless you were ready to disappear. Standing in the hallway after the show was a man in an expensive wool coat, waiting by the elevators. Howard recognized the look immediately, and his stomach did a slow roll. "Mr. Stern," the man said, not waiting for an invitation to speak. "Mr. Ricci would like to have a word with you after your broadcast tonight, in private." Howard looked up from the script he was clutching. "Tell Mr. Ricci I'm pretty tired after these long shifts, maybe another time." The man's expression didn't change, his eyes remaining as cold as the Atlantic in winter. "Mr. Ricci insists," the man replied. Howard sat down his headphones and stood up, walking over to the man and looking him directly in the eyes with a defiance that terrified everyone in the hallway. "Tell Mr. Ricci that Howard Stern doesn't take meetings with people who send messengers. If he wants to talk to me, he can come to this studio himself and ask nicely." The man stared at Howard for a long moment, a silence stretching between them that felt like a death warrant. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll deliver your message," he said before disappearing into the fog of Manhattan. After he left, the studio was shaking. "Howard, do you know who that was?" "That was one of Anthony Ricci's top guys." "Anthony Ricci? You can't just blow him off like that." Howard shrugged and went back to his coffee, though his hands weren't as steady as he wanted them to be. "I can and I did," Howard said. "I don't work for the outfit, I work for the listeners. And last I checked, I'm the one bringing in the ratings here, not Anthony Ricci." He tried to explain to his staff that if he showed an inch of fear in this town, they would take a mile. Howard had grown up around tough guys, and he learned a long time ago that once you start running, you never stop. So, he didn't run. He just went about his business. The next night, the same messenger appeared at the glass of the studio booth. "Mr. Ricci is waiting downstairs in the Cadillac," he said. "He'd like to speak with you now." Howard was taking off his jacket, preparing to head home. Tell Mr. Ricci I already left for the night. But Mr. Stern, you're right here. Am I? Howard said with a sharp smile. I could have sworn I walked out that back door 10 minutes ago. The messenger's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white. Mr. Stern, I don't think you understand the situation. No, pal, I understand perfectly, Howard interrupted. I understand that I just worked my ass off for 4 hours entertaining this godforsaken city. I understand that I'm tired and I'm going to my apartment to have a drink. Now you can stand there and argue with me, or you can deliver my message to your boss. Your choice. The messenger left without another word, and the silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Howard's manager was beside himself, begging him to call a lawyer or even the police. Howard, you're gonna get yourself killed, he screamed. You have to talk to the station owners, they can smooth this over. But Howard refused. I'm not getting anyone involved in this. I'm not meeting with some thug who thinks he can snap his fingers and I'll come running. I'm Howard Stern, and I don't run for anybody. On the day before the incident, word started spreading through the radio station that Anthony Ricci was angry. Very angry. Even the janitors were quietly warning Howard's people that he needed to make peace with Ricci before it was too late. But Howard remained stubborn. That evening, his lead engineer came to the booth. Howard, I'm begging you, just take the 5-minute meeting. What does he even want? Howard asked. The engineer hesitated, looking over his shoulder. I heard it has something to do with his cousin. Apparently, she's a fan of yours and you made a comment about her at a club last week. Anthony thinks you were disrespectful. Howard laughed, a dry and hollow sound. I don't even know who his cousin is. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, the engineer said desperately. Ricci believes it, and in his world, that's all that matters. Just meet him, apologize, tell him you'll stay away from her. Whatever he wants to hear. But Howard was immovable. I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do. If Anthony Ricci has a problem with me, he can bring it up like a man, not through threats and shadows. The night everything came to a head was June 18, 1975. Howard arrived at the station around 8 p.m. for his 9 p.m. show. The atmosphere in the building was tense, the air smelling of ozone and old floor wax. The security guards wouldn't look him in the eye. Something was happening, but nobody would say what. At 8:30 p.m., his producer came to the booth looking terrified. Howard, you need to cancel tonight's show. Why would I do that? Anthony Ricci bought out every seat in the observation gallery. Him and 20 of his guys are out there right now, just sitting in the dark, waiting for you to start. Howard didn't even look up from his notes, adjusting the equalizer on the board. So, they want to hear the show? That makes them listeners like anybody else. Howard, this isn't a joke, they're not here for the music. They're here to send a message. Howard finished with the settings and turned to face her. Then I guess I'd better put on the best show of my life. At 9 p.m., Howard Stern walked into the booth and hit the live switch. The room was packed with a heavy, oppressive silence. He looked out through the glass and immediately saw them. The front row of the gallery was filled with men in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows of their fedoras. And in the center sat Anthony Ricci. He was a big man, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. His eyes were cold and calculating, staring directly at Howard through the glass. Howard smiled at the microphone. Good evening, New York. We've got a great show for you tonight, he said, his voice echoing through the speakers in the gallery. I'm going to play some records, tell some truths, and hopefully we'll all have a wonderful time. He signaled the engineer to start the first track, but his eyes kept drifting back to Ricci. The mobster wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just sitting there staring like a predator waiting for the right moment. Howard finished the first segment, and the silence from the gallery was deafening. Thank you, Howard said into the mic. I noticed some of you in the front row seem a little quiet tonight. Don't worry, I won't take it personally. I know it's hard to clap when you're busy holding a grudge. A few people in the back of the studio laughed nervously, but the men in the front row didn't react. Anthony Ricci's expression didn't change. Howard moved into his next segment, a biting commentary on the city's corruption. About halfway through, Ricci reached into his jacket. Howard saw the movement, and his voice faltered for just a second, his heart skipping a beat. But Ricci wasn't pulling out a gun. He was pulling out a cigarette. He lit it slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off Howard. Then Ricci did something that made the entire room freeze. He made a gesture, a simple gesture, drawing his fingers slowly across his throat. Howard saw it. The engineer saw it. The people in the back saw it. A murmur went through the crowd. Howard stopped talking. The music continued for a few more bars before trailing off into a static-filled silence. Howard stood in that booth, looking directly at Anthony Ricci through the glass. The room was completely silent, millions of people at home wondering why the radio had gone dead. And then Howard did something that nobody expected. He smiled. "Folks, we're going to take a little break from the plan here," Howard said. "See, there's a gentleman in the front row who seems to have something he wants to express. And you know me, I'm all about giving people a voice." Howard signaled the security guard to open the door to the booth. The audience tensed. Anthony Ricci sat perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as Howard walked to the door and stepped out into the gallery. Howard stood there, lanky and defiant, looking down at the mobster. "Sir, I notice you've been making gestures at me all night. Now, I'm not sure if you're trying to tell me something or if you're just practicing your sign language, but either way, it's a little distracting." The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Howard continued, "So here's what I'm thinking. If you've got something to say, why don't you come in there and say it on the mic?" In fact, Howard gestured toward the empty chair in the booth. "Why don't you come in and tell the city of New York what's on your mind? You seem like you might have a lot to say. What do you say, Anthony?" Anthony Ricci stared at Howard for a long moment. This was the moment where he decided whether to kill him or respect him. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then something incredible occurred. Anthony Ricci started to laugh. It wasn't a friendly laugh, it was a cold, gravelly sound, but it was a laugh. He looked at Howard Stern, standing there fearless and slightly amused, and he shook his head. "You got balls, Stern," Ricci said, his voice carrying through the silent gallery. "I'll give you that." Howard smiled back. "Is that a yes on the interview? Because I should warn you, the acoustics in there are better than they look." Ricci shook his head, still smiling that cold smile. "Nah, you keep talking, Howard. That's what you're good at." Howard stood his ground. "You sure? The offer stands. Anytime you want to take over, you just let me know." "I'm sure," Ricci said. Then he added almost as an afterthought, "Keep doing your thing, Howard. You're all right." Howard nodded and walked back into the booth. He picked up the microphone and said to the audience, "Well, folks, looks like I'm going to have to finish this show myself after all. But before we continue, let's have a round of applause for our guest in the front row. He's a tough critic, but a fair one." The audience, still not entirely sure what had happened, applauded nervously as Ricci and his men stood up and walked out of the gallery. After the show, Howard was in the dressing room when there was a knock at the door. Anthony Ricci was standing there alone this time. "Can I come in?" he asked. Howard nodded. "Sure. You want a drink?" Ricci walked in and they stood there for a moment in the quiet of the night. Finally, Ricci spoke. "You know why I wanted to meet you?" "Something about a cousin, I heard," Howard said. Ricci nodded. "My cousin, she's a fan. She was upset about something she thought you said. Turns out she was mistaken." Howard didn't ask what happened to the mistake. He didn't want to know. Ricci took a sip of his drink. "The thing is, Howard, I sent my guy to talk to you 3 times. You blew him off every time. Made me look bad. I can't have that." "So you came to my show to scare me?" Howard asked. Ricci smiled. "Something like that. But you didn't scare, did you?" "I don't scare easy," Howard said. "No, you don't." Ricci finished his drink and headed for the door. "I respect what you did tonight. Most guys would have pissed themselves. But you walked right up to me. That takes guts. Or stupidity, Howard said. Maybe both. Ricci shook his hand. We're good, Howard. You didn't do nothing wrong, and I respect a guy who stands his ground. Just like that, it was over. Howard Stern had survived what could have been the most dangerous night of his life. The story spread through New York like wildfire, and by the next morning, everyone in the business knew that Howard Stern had stood up to the mob and won. He proved that a man with a microphone and enough courage could command respect even from the most dangerous men in the city. He was the king of all media, and on that night in 1975, he proved exactly why.